What if demonic possession was like a virus? Like, how would that change the environment and the people that you live near? When Evil Lurks is a 2023 Argentinian movie about a small town that has to deal with an evil demonic possession. Now, this is the second movie that I've seen from Demian Rugna, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I don't know. He was the writer-director behind the crazy movie Terrified that came out a few years ago, and I'll put a link to a review for that movie in the corner. But at the time, in a nutshell, I thought it had some great visuals and setups, but it was like three movies kind of mashed into one and then played on fast forward. However, with When Evil Lurks, I found this to be a much more balanced storytelling device with a more coherent narrative thread and just sort of better overall pacing. Although, I still feel like it suffers from undercutting its atmosphere a little bit by moving too fast at times. And because of that, some of this movie ends up being a little bit of a double-edged sword. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, the first thing I should say about this movie is, much like Terrified, I give Rugna a lot of credit because he comes up with some crazy ideas. And what I really appreciate about his style is he's able to build a world without feeling the need to bog it down with too much exposition within the setup. Like, we kind of crash landed in this environment and you just kind of have to catch up. Like, in this world, for instance, the movie centers around Pedro and his brother who live on a family farm out in this remote area of a small town. They hear gunshots one night in the woods and decide to go investigate. Now, what they find is a body of a man that's been severed in two. They believe this man was cutting through the woods to get to a nearby house and was attacked. Now, when they go to this nearby house to investigate, they find out that one of the family members in that house has been possessed. And the dead man that was on his way to that house was a cleaner on his way to remove that possession. I'll tell you, like, the gift of storytelling is when you're able to kind of just give enough information so the audience isn't completely lost, but hold back to the point where you are constantly leaning forward to hear more about this story. Now, this movie does a really good job in the beginning, I'll say, of dropping a lot of sort of situational information around without it feeling too much like it's just an expository drop for the audience's sake. At this point, the brothers decide to go to the local police because apparently that is procedure in a situation of a possession. And the police is supposed to contact another cleaner to come out and remove the possessed body. However, the police don't believe the brothers, and so the brothers, along with the help of the landowner named Ruiz, decide to try and deal with the possessed body themselves. Now, this is the central setup which kicks off the entire plot. And as you can imagine, what they try to do doesn't work out so great, and the results spiral out of control in a way that is basically them trying to put the genie back in the bottle. Now, I will say about this type of world building, he does introduce a lot of rules, which generally I love rules. And I was a little surprised by how many there were in this movie. Like, there are 7 main ones that the elders have now turned into a song in order to remind the young people what not to do in the face of encountering a possession. It's an interesting way to handle this, where in this world, possession is kind of a known quantity, despite it being kind of rare, and they mention several times that it mainly happens in the city, not out in the countryside. But there are times in this movie where people are talking about rules or procedures as though we, the audience, already know about them. And it can get a little confusing towards the back half of this movie. Like, it's one thing when the main characters don't know anything or know as much as the audience, and so everyone is sort of catching up and learning. But when everyone in the world already knows more, it does kind of pile up a little bit with the amount of rules, but with little explanation. And so, once again, it kind of creates that cutting both ways effect. Now, the things I really liked about this movie is, one, it is unrelenting. Like, this movie charges forward, no holds barred, and things move fast. There are times when I was barely able to process what I just saw, only for something else to happen that changes the situation entirely. There is that sort of double-edged sword thing again, because obviously, scary is a subjective term, and what works for some people doesn't work for others. But it felt to me like sometimes he's so eager to get to the next setup that I think it shortchanges the current one. Like just a bit. And it's not all the time. Now, another positive is I love the passion in which the characters move about in this film. There is a very strong family message in this movie, and one that the characters take very seriously. It's one where you feel the weight of every decision that they make. Now, that may seem obvious, but there's a lot of times in movies where a desensitizing happens within the film, especially in horror movies, where as the movie goes on, the impact feels less, even though the stakes should be getting higher. That is definitely not the case here. Like, there are some brutal choices made throughout this movie, and they are all felt. Now, the third thing that goes along with both of those first two is the special effects. The special effects here are fantastic. This is a gory movie. And the thing that I thought made it even more impactful was the somewhat casual way that some of this gore was done. Like, there are some really gross moments in this film, but some are dealt with in such a cold, callous way. It makes the act itself hit harder by showing how quickly things can just simply turn on a dime with very little fanfare, inherently pointing out the fragility of both life and the connections that we all have. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is something that is purely speculation on my part, but I thought it was kind of interesting and the reason for my mention of viruses at the top. Now, there'll be a few spoilers in here that I can't really avoid, so if you want to skip ahead, I would suggest doing that if you don't want to hear anything. Now, I haven't seen or read any interviews with Ragnar about this movie, but it felt like it was kind of an allegory to COVID or pandemics in general. It's a small group of people that are living isolated, that all have their own ideas how to deal with a crisis, in this case, a possession, all with the best intentions. Now, there are guidelines that were put in place, but the powers that be got lazy about them as well, and as a result, people take things into their own hands and end up making them worse. For instance, they're told not to use firepower or electricity against it, to wait for a cleaner to dispose of their body. But their mounting frustration and eagerness to get rid of the threat results in bad decisions, and it ends up spreading to children, animals, old people, and ultimately the weakest people first. This is something that at the onset they completely discount and don't take seriously, and talk about how this is something that only really affects city folks, not something that would happen to people in the countryside or should have to worry about. Now, as things get out of control and get more complicated, everyone kind of makes their own decision for their family. But even given the right intentions and the understandable motivations that they have, it ends up kind of working against the overall goal, and as a result, causes more problems. Like I said, I might be reading too much into this one, but just thought I would kind of throw that out there to see if any of you felt the same way. Overall, I thought this movie was powerful, intense, and pretty batshit crazy. And I really had to sit with it for a few days to kind of parse out how I felt about it. It's gory and well made, but I will say Ragnar still has a bit of a tendency to move too fast. And I think that kind of causes it to feel a little rushed in places and maybe miss it from being as impactful as it could have been. I'd give this a B+, but let me know what you think.